Welcome back to the Bible is Art, and this week I want to look at a video of Sam Harris answering the question about what is the meaning of life. And I want to do this because when you first hear it, you're like, that's kind of an interesting argument, and it gets like pretty circuitous. But when you break it down, you realize that, oh, it's actually not that interesting, and it's actually kind of silly. So let's check it out. So Sam Harris was on Lex Fridman's podcast, and he just asked him out straight,
what is the meaning of life?
Okay, so one thing preliminarily about the question of meaning. So when people ask this question, that meaning has a content. That's part of the experience. It's part of the phenomena of the experience of meaningfulness. Sometimes philosophers will just think that, like, oh, you have this word and it's like a bucket that can be filled with anything. And so a lot of times they'll give like a subjective answer to it. And so they'll say, oh yeah, you yourself or your community can come up with purposes, and that's like the meaning of life. But the problem of that is that the objectivity and the purposefulness, the teleology, is part of the phenomena. It's part of the experience of the question of meaning. People sense that, and so they're being like, what is this? It's the same thing with moral values, right? It's not just the fact that I experience a sense of obligation to do something. Part of the phenomenological structure of morality that it is objective. That's part of the content, and that's part of what you need to give an accounting for. And so you can't just ignore it, right? Because that's part of the experience, right? You have to give an explanation for that. So how do we know that objectivity and purposefulness is part of what people mean when they're asking about meaning? Well, do this thought experiment. So say you're talking with someone and they say, hey, what's the meaning of life? And you say, okay, well, I want you to ask that question again, but instead you can't use the word meaning. And this is a helpful experiment because it gets down to what people actually mean, right? Sometimes our problems are just in the use of words. And so you say, okay, let's just table that, and we say, okay, what do you mean by meaning? And they say, and most people would say, oh, is there a purpose in life? Okay, so that's the first thing, that like most people would substitute the word meaning for purpose, which means that purpose is part of their experience of this meaning question. Okay, but what about the objectivity side? Well, if you think about this, when someone is asking the question about meaning, they can already do whatever they want. It has to be something more than simply subjective, because they're wondering, am I doing what I should be doing? Is there something else that I should be doing? And so in the very structure of asking the question, they assume that, oh, what I'm talking about is objective. It's outside of me. It's not something that I invent. So when people are asking about meaning, they're asking about its objectivity and purposefulness.
It's either the wrong question or that question is answered by paying sufficient attention to any present moment such that there's no basis upon which to pose that question. It's not answered in the usual way. It's not a matter of having more information. It's having more engagement with reality as it is in the present moment, or consciousness as it is in the present moment. You don't ask that question when you're most captivated by the most important thing you ever pay attention to. That question only gets asked when you're abstracted away from that experience, that peak experience.
So Sam's fundamental argument here is to say, hey, this is not the right question, because you only ask this question when you are not in a sort of experience of meaningfulness. So that is to say, when you are fully attentive to something, whether it's a sport, whether it's romance, whatever it is, you don't ask this question, right? Because you're fully enveloped in there. And for him, he say, therefore, what that means is that experience is meaningfulness in and of itself. Like, why aren't you asking about that question there? And when you first hear that, you're like, oh, that's kind of interesting, right? Like, yeah, like, why am I not questioning this? Maybe because while I'm playing tennis, I am experiencing meaning, right? When I'm in the flow of things, when I'm completely attentive, when I'm not distracted, when I'm totally focused on whatever it is. And he's going to say that, oh, what we need to do is we need to cultivate that attentiveness, not just to these sort of peak experiences of pleasure, but we need to cultivate it towards everything in life. So even the most mundane things, and he says, so that these become diaphanous, which is a beautiful thing, right? Now, it does seem like, okay, that's like kind of interesting, but okay, so think about this for a second. What he is saying is that, oh, when you are totally enveloped, that is the experience of meaningfulness. But there is a few assumptions in there. That is to say, there's a few unproven premises, some assertions that don't have an argument behind them. The problem with that argument is assuming that because you are not asking the question, because you are distracted, therefore it doesn't matter. That is the hidden premise of his argument that he needs to provide support for. And there's good reasons to think that that's false. For example, he says that, oh, meaningfulness happens when you're fully attending to this thing and you're not asking that question. Okay, that's one possibility. What's an equally plausible possibility? Well, an equally plausible possibility would be to say, oh, you are distracted and you should be attending to the question, right? That's precisely the question at hand, right? Is there a meaning? And he is just stipulating, that is, he's just asserting, oh, this is the meaning. You're like, well, how do I know that that's the meaning to be fully attentive there? How do I know I'm not just being distracted? So let me explain this with an analogy. So let's say you have to do some laundry, but you also agreed to go play tennis with your buddy. So you go play tennis, and while you're playing tennis, you're like in the flow. You're completely attentive to tennis. Does that therefore answer the question of your laundry? No, it does not. It's still a question that needs to be addressed. Just because you are fully attentive does not assume that that thing is therefore the answer to the question, the problem. Because I'm fully enveloped in tennis, therefore this other question, I don't have to even answer it. No, and what's even fascinating is sometimes the structure is the opposite, right? So sometimes being completely enveloped in something is actually a vice, right? And so you think about this common scenario where you have a politician who is very, very wealthy. And the argument that will be leveled against this politician will be say, hey, because you are completely consumed in this world, you're attentive in this world, you are ignoring the questions, the things that you should be attending to. And that is the question that we're asking about. Sam thinks that because you don't ask the question, therefore, it doesn't require answering. So Sam is saying, hey, if you're really paying attention to every moment, you won't ask the question. But that does not answer the question, should I? So in the end, Sam doesn't actually answer the question. He just says, you need to be completely distracted so you don't ask the question. But what if I do ask the question? What if I want to know if there's a meaning in the world that is purposeful and objective? Well, that we are still waiting for. So Sam will say that, when you come down off of these high experiences, it's only at that point that you start asking the question of meaning. And what? Right? Sometimes after an experience, you gain clarity about that experience. You want to know its meaning. And often our experience when we come off of a high, especially a vicious high, we think to ourselves, that wasn't all it was cut out to be, and we're left feeling vacuous. Now, his answer is to say, hey, we need more of those experiences. Now, of course, he's going to say, no, it shouldn't be like vicious experiences. We need to be like that in every experience. So ultimately, his argument is to say, hey, make sure you're distracted enough that you don't ask the question about meaning. But of course, maybe you should be asking about meaning, just like the rich ruler should be asking questions that don't come naturally to him. Maybe you should be doing your dirty laundry. Just saying to be distracted and you won't answer the question just pushes the question aside. So what Sam needs to do is needs to answer the question, why should I not ask that question? And of course, that comes back to very fundamental philosophical and theological questions like, is there actually meaning in the world? And if there isn't, then you are welcome to go on and ignoring it, fully immersing yourself in the world. But if there is meaning, well, then you had better attend to that. Thanks so much for watching the video this week. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so at patreon.com/thebiblesart. And I'll see you in the next one.